If you have green eyes, stop for a second and actually look at them in a mirror later today, because what you're looking at is not a color, it's a coincidence. A 1 in 50 coincidence that took 10,000 years, a horseback migration across 2 continents, and a single stranger you will never know the name of to land on your face. Green eyes show up in roughly 2% of people on Earth, not 2% of a country. 2% of the species. Redheads, for comparison, make up somewhere around 1 to 2% as well, and everyone treats red hair like a genetic celebrity. Left-handed people are close to 10%, so if you've got green eyes, you are statistically rarer than a redhead and 5 times rarer than someone left-handed, and almost nobody has ever pointed that out to you. For most of history, nobody could explain why, and when people can't explain something, they don't stay curious about it for long. They turn it into a story instead. Green-eyed women in parts of medieval Europe were sometimes accused of witchcraft simply for looking different in a village where everyone else had brown eyes. In other places, green eyes got fused with jealousy and suspicion, which is exactly why English still uses green with envy, and the green-eyed monster centuries later. Nobody consciously remembers where that phrase came from anymore. It just survived, the same way the trait itself survived, quietly riding along inside a language that forgot its own origin story. Here's the part almost nobody knows going in. The real explanation is stranger than any of the folklore. Scientists have now traced the trait back through the DNA itself, and the trail doesn't stay in Europe where most people assume it started. It runs backward through time to a single region, and then it runs forward again in a direction that surprises almost everyone, deep into the mountains of Central and South Asia, thousands of miles from where the story is supposed to end. And the mythology didn't stop at witchcraft. In parts of the Middle East and North Africa, light or unusual eye colors were sometimes folded into beliefs about the evil eye, a superstition so persistent it produced entire traditions of protective charms meant to guard against a striking gaze. In other cultures, green eyes were treated as almost prophetic, a mark that a person could see things others couldn't. None of these explanations agreed with each other, and that disagreement is itself a clue. When a trait is rare enough that most communities only encounter it once or twice in a generation, every culture ends up inventing its own private theory in isolation, with nobody checking their version against anyone else's. That's what an unanswered question looks like when it's left open for 10,000 years. Not silence, but a pile-up of contradictory folklore, each version told with total confidence by people who simply had no other tools to explain what they were seeing. Before we get into how strange this actually gets, if you've got green eyes or someone in your life does, drop a comment with where your family is from. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why that answer might connect to people on the complete opposite side of the planet. Let's start with the map, because it's not evenly spread out, and the unevenness is the first clue. The highest concentration of green eyes anywhere on Earth is in the north and west of Europe. Ireland and Scotland sit at the top, with a huge share of the population carrying some version of the trait. Move south and east across the rest of Europe, and the numbers steadily drop. By the time you reach East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, or the Americas before European contact, green eyes are almost non-existent. That's not random noise. A trait doesn't casually thin out across a continent by accident. It thins out because it's tracing the exact path of an ancient migration, written directly into the faces of billions of descendants who have no idea they're carrying a map. Now here's the detail that quietly breaks people's brains the first time they hear it. Green eyes are not green. There's no green pigment anywhere in the human eye. Not a trace. If you took a green iris apart at the molecular level, you would never isolate a single green molecule because one doesn't exist in human biology. So what are you actually seeing when you look at green eyes? You're seeing a trick of physics, not a paint color. It comes down to a pigment called melanin, the same pigment behind skin tone and hair color, and melanin only comes in shades of brown and black, nothing else. Load the iris with a lot of it, and you get dark brown eyes. Cut that amount down and you drift toward hazel. Cut it down even further, almost to nothing, and something else takes over entirely, light itself. The front layer of the iris is a thin, semi-translucent tissue. When light hits it, the longer wavelengths, the reds and warm yellows, pass through and get absorbed by the darker tissue underneath. But the shorter blue wavelengths bounce back out toward the viewer instead of getting absorbed. That's it. That's blue eyes. It's the identical optical principle that makes the daytime sky look blue even though the atmosphere itself is colorless, short wavelengths scattering back at you instead of a pigment being present. A blue-eyed person is, in a very literal sense, reflecting sky physics out of their skull every time someone looks at them. This is also why eye color is genuinely one of the most misleading phrases in everyday language. We talk about it like it's a fixed paint chip, one of a handful of preset options a person got assigned at birth. In reality, it's a live optical process, happening every single time light enters the eye, recalculated constantly depending on how much melanin is sitting in that tissue and how the light bounces off it. Change the lighting in the room, and a hazel or green eye can visibly shift shade, brighter and more golden under warm light, cooler and grayer under overcast skies. People often assume they're imagining it. They're not. They're watching the same physics that colors the sky respond in real time to a change in the light source. So where does green come from if it isn't just less blue? Green is the harder trick. It needs that same low melanin scattering effect working underneath, but on top of it, there has to be a thin wash of a separate yellowish pigment called lipochrome, blue light scattering up from below, a soft yellow layer sitting above it, and your brain fuses the two signals into what reads as green. It's not one ingredient. It's two, layered in a narrow window that has to line up almost exactly. Too much melanin and the yellow gets swallowed into hazel or brown. Too little and there's no yellow wash to blend with the blue at all, and you land on pure blue instead. Blue eyes are essentially what happens by default when pigment drops low. Green eyes are what happens when pigment drops low and a second unrelated ingredient shows up at exactly the right dose at exactly the same time. That's the actual reason green is so much rarer than blue. It isn't one lucky roll of the dice, it's two. So who decides whether you get that exact combination? That comes down to your DNA, and specifically to a stretch of it that most people have never heard of, sitting on chromosome 15. There are two genes doing almost all the work here. The first is called OCA2, and its job is straightforward. It helps control how much melanin gets produced in the iris. Think of it as the factory. The second gene is called HERC2, and this one is the actual key to the whole story. HERC2 doesn't produce pigment itself. It sits right next to OCA2 and acts like a dimmer switch, turning that melanin factory up or down. A small change inside HERC2 can quietly tell the whole system to produce far less pigment than it normally would. And that single switch is exactly what geneticists found when they went looking for the root of light-colored eyes in humans. Here's where the story turns from interesting into genuinely startling. Researchers comparing the DNA of light-eyed people from wildly different parts of the world, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years of history, kept finding the exact same tiny variant in that HERC2 switch. Not a similar mutation, the identical one at the identical spot in the genetic code, every single time. And in genetics, that's not a coincidence you can wave away. Random mutations essentially never land on the same letter of DNA independently in two different people, let alone in millions of them scattered across continents. When a variant is identical everywhere it appears, there's only one real explanation. It happened once, in one person. And every single carrier alive today inherited it from that same original source. Sit with that for a second, because it means something specific about you if your eyes are light. Somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, near the shores of the Black Sea, in the borderlands between Eastern Europe and Western Asia, one human being was born with a tiny copying error in that pigment switch. No name, no title, almost certainly not a person of any particular status, just someone living in a small farming or herding community. The kind of life that left behind no monument and no written record of any kind. And instead of that error disappearing the way most mutations do within a generation or two, it spread. It moved through descendants, through migrations, through marriages, through famines and wars and centuries with no written history to track it, all the way down to the mirror you looked into this morning. We will never know if that person was seen as strange for it, admired for it, or never even had it commented on at all. They left nothing behind except a single line of code that outlasted every empire that came after them. Every time a baby is born today with light-colored eyes, that anonymous ancestor is technically still here. Not in stone, not in any archive, but in living tissue, passed hand to hand for 400 generations without ever once being interrupted. Blue eyes are essentially the story of that one switch on its own. Green eyes are that same ancient switch plus the extra layer, the lipochrome, the finer-tuned combination of several supporting genes working together. So green eyes didn't appear independently somewhere else. They grew directly out of that same Black Sea mutation, then got shaped further as that original population mixed with new groups on a much longer journey. Which raises an obvious question. Why did any of this survive at all? A mutation that reduces pigment doesn't make you stronger, faster, or better at finding food. In pure survival terms, it should have been a footnote that quietly died out within a handful of generations. Instead, it spread across an entire hemisphere. There are two leading explanations, and they likely both played a role. The first is sunlight. As early populations pushed north and east into regions with weaker sun and long, dark winters, lighter eyes appear to have traveled alongside lighter skin, and lighter skin helps the body manufacture vitamin D more efficiently when sunlight is scarce. Eye color and skin color share overlapping genetic machinery, so the light eye trait may simply have hitched a ride on a change that had nothing to do with vision at all. The second explanation is more human, and honestly more fun to think about. Rarity gets noticed. In small ancient communities where nearly everyone shared the same dark eyes, someone born with a strikingly different color would have stood out immediately. Standing out in a small population tends to mean getting remembered, and getting remembered has always had a strange habit of turning into getting chosen. Over enough generations, simply being memorable can function as its own quiet survival advantage. The likely truth is a blend of both forces working at once, biology handing the trait an excuse to spread, and human attention handing it a reason to stick around. So we've got an origin point. One person, one switch, one region near the Black Sea. Now here's the part of the story that almost never gets told, because most retellings stop at Europe and assume that's the whole map. It isn't. The trail keeps going, and it goes east. Around 5,000 years ago, waves of herders from the grasslands north of the Black Sea began expanding outward in nearly every direction at once. These were people who had domesticated the horse and built a way of life around constant movement across open plains, and they carried their genetics with them the way any migrating population does. Automatically, invisibly, folded into every child born along the way. Some of these groups pushed west into the heart of Europe. Others turned east and south, moving into Central Asia along the same corridors that would later become the great trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean. They brought their language, their livestock, their tools, and buried inside all of it, without anyone knowing or caring at the time, the same ancient light-eye mutation. Modern ancient DNA studies have actually caught this migration in the act. When researchers sequence skeletons pulled from steppe burial sites dated to this period, a striking number of them carry that same light-eye variant, sitting right alongside genetic markers for pale skin and, in some individuals, unusually tall stature. A genetic package that swept outward from the grasslands north of the Black Sea and reshaped the ancestry of both Europe and large parts of Asia within only a few thousand years. This wasn't a trait spreading gradually, neighbor to neighbor, over some almost slow and even trickle of contact. It was riding on top of one of the largest and fastest population expansions in the human genetic record, carried by people who could cover in weeks what earlier populations would have taken generations to cross on foot. Centuries later, that entire stretch of territory became threaded together by the network of routes historians now call the Silk Road. Not one single road, but a sprawling web of paths carrying merchants, soldiers, and travelers back and forth for well over 1,000 years. Wherever people trade, people also mix, and genes travel exactly as easily as goods do. The light-eye trait that had started as a regional quirk on the western steppe slowly worked its way into the mountain valleys and desert oases scattered across Central Asia. And in a handful of especially isolated pockets, cut off by mountain ranges and simple distance from the constant genetic mixing happening elsewhere, that trait didn't just arrive. It got trapped, and it concentrated. Deep in the mountains of northern Pakistan sits a small, remote community called the Kalash, and for generations, they've looked strikingly different from every population around them. Fair skin, light hair, and a notably high rate of green and blue eyes in a region where that combination should statistically be almost absent. For decades, the popular explanation was romantic and specific, that the Kalash were the descendants of soldiers from Alexander the Great's army, left behind more than 2,000 years ago when the campaign moved on without them. It's a great story, and it still shows up in travel guides today. It also turned out to be mostly wrong. When geneticists actually sequenced Kalash DNA, the ancestry split off from surrounding populations thousands of years before Alexander was even born. Their light eyes aren't a souvenir from a famous army. They're a far older inheritance. The same deep stream of West Eurasian ancestry that carried that original mutation east out of the steppe long before any of the empire's people tried to credit it to had even formed. The legend got the drama right and the timeline completely wrong. The truth underneath it is quieter and honestly more impressive. And the Kalash aren't an isolated exception. Travel through the mountain valleys of Central and South Asia, and you keep running into the same pattern. In the Hunza Valley and pockets of Afghanistan, in the highlands of Nuristan and Chitral, green and light-colored eyes show up far more often than geography alone would ever predict. Each of these communities functions like an accidental time capsule, holding onto a genetic signal that arrived thousands of years ago and then simply never got diluted, because the mountains around them kept the rest of the world at arm's length. In a busy, well-mixed population, a rare trait tends to blend into the crowd within a handful of generations, wall a community off behind mountain passes for centuries, with marriage largely staying inside the group. And the opposite happens. The trait doesn't fade, it locks in and concentrates. These valleys became unintentional laboratories preserving a slice of deep ancestral history that the rest of the world had already blended away. This is also why geneticists get genuinely excited about places like this instead of treating them as curiosities. Most of human history left no written record at all, so the only surviving evidence of who moved where and when is locked inside the DNA of living people. A well-mixed, highly connected population is actually harder to read. Thousands of years of intermarriage smear the signal until the original source becomes almost impossible to isolate. An isolated mountain population does the opposite. It behaves like a sealed capsule, holding a much cleaner, much older signature intact, largely undisturbed by everything that happened in the more connected world around it. Sequencing a Kalash genome or a Hunza genome isn't just measuring eye color. It's closer to pulling a fragment of 10,000-year-old ancestry out of the ground and reading it directly off a living person, without needing to find so much as a single bone. There's actually a face from this exact region that most of the world has already seen without knowing any of this backstory. In the mid-1980s, a photographer captured a portrait of a young Afghan refugee with piercing green eyes. The image went on to become one of the most recognized photographs of the 20th century, printed on the cover of a major international magazine. For years, people were captivated by that photo without being able to fully explain why it hit as hard as it did. Part of it is simple rarity. Green eyes read as almost otherworldly precisely because they're so uncommon. But the deeper answer is everything we just walked through. That photograph wasn't capturing an anomaly. It was capturing the visible endpoint of an invisible 10,000-year journey. A mutation that began near the Black Sea, rode east on horseback across the steppe, drifted down the Silk Road for 1,000 years, and finally surfaced, completely by chance, in the face of one child in the mountains of Central Asia. So bring this all the way back to you, sitting there with your own green eyes, or watching this because someone you love has them. What you're carrying is not a European trait, or an Asian trait, or a trait that belongs to any single country or bloodline. It's the same tiny genetic switch showing up in a fishing village in Ireland and in a mountain valley in Pakistan, in Scotland and in Afghanistan, in Turkey, and in the Hunza Valley. All of it traced back to one nameless person who happened to be born with a copying error in their DNA thousands of years before any of those countries existed as ideas, let alone borders on a map. A green-eyed person in rural Scotland and a green-eyed person in a Kalash mountain village are, in a very real and literal genetic sense, distant cousins, both quietly carrying a fragment of the same forgotten ancestor. The categories we use to sort people today, nationality, ethnicity, the neat little regional slices on an ancestry app, are almost all far younger and far shallower than the DNA sitting underneath them. And that's actually why a standard ancestry test can feel exciting and strangely hollow at the same time. It'll hand you a tidy pie chart. Some percentage European, some percentage Central or South Asian, whatever the blend happens to be, and then stop right there, as if the percentages were the whole answer. They're not. A pie chart can't tell you that the exact same mutation sitting in your iris is also sitting in a mountain village on the other side of the world, or that it began with a single person on the edge of Asia long before any of the regions on that chart even existed as concepts. The percentages are the surface, the actual inheritance, the movement, the horses, the Silk Road, the mountain isolation, is the story buried underneath them, and it's the part almost no consumer DNA kit ever bothers to tell you. A few smaller details worth knowing while we're here, because the trait comes with some interesting side effects. Because green eyes carry less melanin than brown ones, more light passes through the iris, which can make them somewhat more sensitive to bright sunlight. That's not a flaw, it's just the same low pigment mechanism that produces the color in the first place, showing up in a different way day to day. There's also early research looking at possible subtle links between eye color and other traits, though that field is still young, and it's worth being skeptical of anyone claiming your eye color says anything meaningful about your personality. What's genuinely solid, backed by real genetic evidence rather than speculation, is everything about the ancestry itself. The single origin point, the migration, the shared route running under populations that look completely unrelated on the surface. One last detail, and it's a strangely fitting way to end this. A huge number of green-eyed people weren't actually born with green eyes at all. Plenty of babies arrive with grayish or bluish eyes, simply because the melanin in the iris hasn't finished developing yet at birth. Over the following months, and sometimes over the first couple of years of life, that pigment slowly fills in, and the lipochrome layer settles into place, and the final color gradually emerges. A baby who starts out looking blue can shift toward green right in front of you, as that ancient recipe quietly finishes cooking in real time. The same combination of scattering light and yellow pigment that took 10,000 years and a journey across 2 continents to reach your family, playing out again in a matter of months, right there in the crib. There's also a strange kind of humility built into all of this, if you sit with it long enough. Every empire that existed near the Black Sea in the last 10,000 years is gone. Every king, every border, every religion that claimed permanence in that region has already been rewritten or erased at least once. The one thing that made it through intact, without edits, without translation errors, without a single generation choosing to abandon it, is a 4-letter change in a strand of DNA carried by a farmer nobody wrote down. Stone crumbles, empires collapse. A copying error in a gene, it turns out, is one of the most durable things a human being has ever produced. and it didn't require anyone to try. So the next time you catch your own reflection or somebody comments on your eyes like it's just a color, you'll know it never was. It's a message. One that started with an anonymous farmer by the Black Sea, rode a horse across the steppe, crossed the Silk Road on foot, got trapped and preserved in a mountain valley for thousands of years, and finally, against odds that should have erased it 100 times over, made it all the way to you.